In this video, we're going to talk about while loops, and while loops are an alternative to for loops. What we'll see is we'll use both of them quite a bit. If you remember last time, for loops were really for when we know how many times we're going to repeat our loop. We might not know that when we write the program. It might depend on some user input or some calculation we're doing, but by the time the loop starts, we should know how many times it will repeat. So maybe if the user typed in 5 earlier before the loop, then by the time we get to the loop, we know we're going to repeat the loop 5 times. A while loop is for a different scenario when we don't know how many times it will repeat. So one example would be a simple adding machine. We're going to get input from the user, and whatever numbers they type in, we're going to add it up. And we're just going to keep doing that until the user types 0 as an input. So when we go into our loop, we're not sure how many times we'll repeat. It could be 3 times, it could be 100 times. It's going to depend on the user. And at the end, when we're done, after they've typed 0, we'll display our total. So in order to do this, we'll start and say our total is 0 to give it an initial value. We'll get the input from the user, and if that input is not 0, we'll go into our loop. We'll add that input to the total, we'll get another input from the user, and go back and repeat that process over and over again. Eventually the user will type in 0, and so input not equals 0 will be false. We'll go to the end and display the total. So this is a similar format to our for loop. We have this looping process, and you can even see an initialization where we get the input from the user, the condition input is not equal to 0, and the update where we get input from the user again. But it's not going to be really short and simple like a for loop, so we're not all going to put it in the same spot. The way we'll write this is we'll just have while, and then in the parentheses we'll have the condition. And while that is true, we will do the body of the loop. So we will keep repeating it and checking every time through the loop, is the condition still true? Is the condition still true? Is the condition still true? And when it's not, we'll then exit the loop and continue the rest of the program. So in this case, our condition is just input is not equal 0. So while that is true, we will continue looping. And the body of the loop is just this total plus equals input. That's just adding input to our total and getting the next input from the user. I'm skipping any prompts or things like that. We'll add that in the real program later. To get the rest of the program, we just add total equals 0 up at the top, get the input initially, then we go into our loop, repeat things as long as we'd like, and at the bottom we display our total. So let's see this in action. Initially we start with our total is equal to 0. We get input from the user. Let's say they type in the number 4. Input is not equal to 0. So that's true. We'll go into our loop. We'll add input to our total. Now it's 4. We'll get another input from the user. Let's say they type in 5. We hit the bottom of our loop, so we go back up to the condition. 5 is not equal to 0, so that's true. We continue inside of our loop. We add our total to the add our input to the total. It's now 9. We get another input from the user. Let's say they type in 0 now. We go to the bottom of the loop. We go up, we look at that condition, 0 is not equal to 0, that's false, so our loop is done. We're going to continue with the rest of the program and display the total 9 on the screen. Let me show you a common mistake to make as we're writing a program, and I do this all the time, so be on the lookout for this, you'll do it a lot. What if we forget to get an extra input from the user? So I've commented out this line to make it very explicit, but in our while loop we forget to ask the user for their next input. What's going to happen is total will start as 0. Input, let's say they type in 4 like the last time. So input is not equal to 0. That's true. So we add 4 to our total. But we skip this line. We're not executing that line, so we don't get another input from the user. Input is still 4. They haven't had a chance to type anything in. So we go back here. 4 is still not equal to 0. We add 4 to the total. We get 8. And we skip that line again. What's happening here is we will never have a chance to type something different than 4 in as our input. So our loop will continue forever. This is just going to keep going and going and going, and this is called an infinite loop. What it will look like, and we'll see this in a second, is that the program has just totally frozen. It's going to keep going in a cycle and going in a cycle, and it'll never get to the end of the loop where it displays the total. So let's see our program in action. This is the exact same program I had in the PowerPoint slide, but I've just added in the filler that I left out. So I create the scanner up at the top. I add the prompts here as we get input, so it's not just a blank screen. And then I close the keyboard at the bottom. So let's click run and see this go. And let's do the same thing we did before. We'll say 4, and it'll just keep repeating. 5, let's keep going a few more times. 6, 7, and then when I'm done, I'm going to type in 0. It should have added those up, so let's do that ahead. 4 plus 5 is 9, 6 is 15, 7 is 22, so we should get an answer of 22 at the bottom. So this works perfectly. We can do this with different numbers, and we'll just get one number here. We can even just quit the first time. If we type in 0, it never goes into the loop, it just displays a total of 0 at the bottom. Now let's look at that error that we made before, if we forget to ask the user for input. And I'm going to comment out the prompt as well, and then comment out the input here. So our while loop now is never changing input. It's never going to be possible, if input is not 0 at the beginning, it's never going to be possible for it to become 0 later on. And this will create an infinite loop. Let's look at what this looks like. So I'm going to run the program. If I type in 4 here, you'll notice it looks like our program has just kind of frozen. It's actually running. It's kind of frantically adding 4 to total many times per second. But we can't see that. So it looks almost like it's waiting for us to type in some input. We'll notice that the red square is still here, telling us our program is still running, but it's just going to run like this forever. So this is called an infinite loop. This is the most difficult one to understand because it's stuck in this loop and we don't see anything happening. If we can't figure out what's happening, we don't know why our program has seemingly frozen, one of the best ways to solve this is to use the debugger. So we know that it got to this enter first number line. I'm going to put a little mark here, and I'm going to do that by right-clicking, clicking toggle breakpoint, and I right-clicked just to the left of that 9, so in that little margin to the left of the line numbers. And you can see now there's a little circle there. That is telling the program, when you run, I would like you to stop there and break so I can see what's happening. If I click the normal play button, it'll just run. It won't stop there. What I'm going to do is click the little bug right next to it. So I'm going to click debug, and as soon as it hits a point where it's going to stop, I get this little dialog box. I'm going to click yes. It's going to change my view for me, and this will help me understand a little bit better what's going on in the program. So what's happening is I see some variables up at the top. It's telling me total is 0, some other information about args and keyboard that we'll ignore for now. And then we've got the output at the bottom. And the code itself is much smaller. We wouldn't want to write our program this way because we can't see much code at a time, but we're getting some other information about debugging that's really helpful. Then I'm going to use the buttons up at the top, step into or step over. These essentially go to the next line of code, but if we call a method that we wrote, step into will go into that method. Otherwise, step over will, if we call a method that we wrote, it'll run that method and wait until we get to the next line. It doesn't really matter in this case, but you can use when you have methods, you can play around with those and see the difference. So you'll notice it says F6, you can click that instead, or just keep clicking step over. I'll click step over, it'll go to the next line. Step over. Now it's actually kind of frozen because it's waiting for us to type input. So I'll put in 4. And then I'm just going to keep clicking step over. And you'll notice it just keeps repeating these two lines over and over again. And it doesn't actually, in a lot of the examples, I kind of highlight this closing brace. It skips that. It just knows that when it gets to the last line inside the loop, it should go up to the condition. But this is helpful for us. We can see now here that when it looks like it's frozen, it's actually stuck inside of this while loop. So if we're not sure what's going on, this debugger can be very helpful for us. And it's not just helpful in this kind of situation, it can be really helpful anytime we're running a program. If we want to see the program run line by line, see what value the variables have, and see what the program is doing at each step, the debugger is a fantastic way to do that and figure out why our program is not behaving the way we want it to. One last thing about the debugger, when we're done, I'm going to stop the program. I would like to go back to the normal view so I can write code. That's up in the top right. So it switched into this debug mode. You'll see the little bug there. I'm going to click the Java mode, and it will switch back to the view that lets me edit Java the way I normally would. If I don't want this breakpoint here, normally I'm going to just click Run Program and it'll ignore the breakpoints. But if I would like to debug something else and I want to get rid of that breakpoint, I'm going to right click, toggle breakpoint, and it'll disappear.